It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, that is Professor Jonathan Buttaci, who did his doctorate at University of Pittsburgh, and but more importantly, of course, he's a domer, and he's now a professor in philosophy at the Catholic University of America, and a much loved professor there. So he will be speaking to us today on Aristotle on intellectual identity, actual and potential. And there's, at least on the sheet that I have, there's a subtitle, or it's an alternative title, Cognizing as Doing in Aristotle. So let us welcome Professor Buttaci.
Thanks, Father, and thanks to the organizers. I'm really grateful to be here to give this paper. All right. So given that our theme is cognizing as being, my contribution takes as its starting point the idea that, at least for Aristotle, and maybe for others working in kindred traditions, being is best understood not as a static state of affairs, but as a special sort of activity. Indeed, the argument of Aristotle's metaphysics plausibly proceeds toward a conception of activity that can complete his account of being qua being, perhaps most of all in his account of the highest being. The divine being is pure activity with no admixture of potentiality, the activity of which is famously identified with thinking. Oh, there's a handout coming around. Even in the less perfect case of human intellect and thinking, where potentiality and its gradual actualization play a considerable role, Aristotle gives a certain priority to cognitive activity. So with being understood as activity, and now serving as a thematic middle term, I seek to understand cognizing as a kind of doing, by which I mean a certain kind of activity or energeia. So against that more general background, my more specific aim is to understand Aristotle's view that there is some sort of identity between knower and known, so that in both intellectual and perceptual cognition, cognizers somehow come to be the objects they cognize. I'm going to use cognition, cognitive, cognize, and related words to mean generically and hold generically of perception and intellection in Aristotle. And there's texts in Aristotle that establish this. It tracks the word gnosis, which gets translated into Latin as cognitio. So that's what I'm going to do there. My own strategy, rather, I examine a debate where to locate the cognitive identity within Aristotle's schema of act and potency, as it is usually conceived, with special attention to a passage from his account of intellect. My own strategy will be to explore Aristotle's claim that whenever we learn by doing the things we are learning to do. In view of this commitment to learning by doing, I argue that activities of thinking temporally precede the dispositional knowledge, even in an individual case. Accordingly, cognitive identity is achieved principally at the level of activity in both intellectual and perceptual cases, though the two cases differ in large part because perceptual capacities develop by nature and not by prior activity. I think greater attention to intellectual learning by doing advances our understanding of this identity of knower and known and the activities involved in that intellectual achievement. Through the process of learning, Aristotle thinks that states or hexes of thought settle into the mind as a result of engaging in this prior intellectual activity. I think he understands those activities in turn as the mind somehow coming to be the things it is considering. These active episodes of intellectual identity come first. Therefore, Aristotle's account of formal reception and the identity of knower and known is best understood as an activity. This achievement is not principally a having, but a doing. All right, so there's three preliminaries I need to go through. The first one is called, by many, a term introduced by Miles Bernier, it's called the triple scheme. And this is an important passage, and I'll quote part of it, but it's quoted in full on your handout. In one way, something is a knower as we might call man a knower, because man is of the class of knowers and of those having knowledge. In another way, as we call someone a knower who already possesses, for example, grammatical knowledge. Each of these is capable, but not in the same way. The one because his genus and his matter is of a certain sort, the other because he can contemplate at will, unless something from without should stand in the way. But the one already contemplating is actually and properly knowing this alpha. So you're deploying grammatical knowledge, knowing this particular case. I'm just going to use the English word contemplate. It's hard to come up with an adequate translation of theorein. So if you're just hear theorein if you know the Greek range, but contemplate in a very special sense for Aristotle. So this is a locus classicus for Aristotle's distinctions between sorts of actuality and potentiality. Even people who are working in other areas of Aristotle's thought will appeal to this passage from De Anima 2:5. The idea is natural and familiar enough. There are three identifiable stages in the development and deployment of certain capacities. For example, having the ability to learn grammar or Greek, but not yet having learned it. Having learned Greek and being able to speak it at will or read it, as the case may be, but not now reading or speaking it. And the third stage, presently speaking or reading Greek. In other words, deploying the knowledge you have. So this passage establishes that the first two are capable. There are two kinds of potentiality or dunamis, while only the third is said to be in actuality. So that's this word entelecheia. And that person is active. He's engaged in activity, energeia. So this passage is often read together with a remark that Aristotle makes about actuality when defining soul earlier in the first chapter of Book 2. It provides a less complete schema, but supplies an important feature that goes unmentioned in 2:5. So these passages need to be read together. He says, matter is potentiality and the form is actuality, and actuality is said in two ways. On the one hand, like knowledge, and on the other hand, like contemplating. Okay, he actually says that, makes that same distinction twice in the same chapter. So when we take these two passages together, Aristotle's view seems to be that the inactive possession of knowledge can be regarded as a capacity for deliberate intellectual activity, and active episodes of knowing, as in the 2:5 passage, but it can also be a kind of actuality and cognitive achievement in its own right, as in this 2:1 passage. The stage marked by inactive possession of knowledge has therefore commonly been called first actuality, a term taken from Aristotle's definition of soul. This stage is both the first sense of entelecheia, or actuality, given in 2:1, and also the fulfillment of the first sort of potentiality from 2:5, namely every human being's native capacity to learn. It has become common to call the third stage in this schema second actuality, since it is the second sense of this term entelecheia named in 2:1, and is the fulfillment of the second sort of potentiality given in 2:5, namely an activity. Okay, so that's the first preliminary. The second preliminary is this analogy Aristotle works through between perceptual and intellectual cases, those cases of cognition. So those several distinctions that I've just gone through might surprise you to learn if you're not familiar with these texts. They come not as part of Aristotle's account of intellect, but rather at the start of his account of perception. The chapter 2:5 begins, "Let us speak generally about the whole of perception." So to begin his account of perceptual activities and achievements, Aristotle relies upon a certain analogy with intellect. Now, there's a lot to be said here about this passage, so I'm going to try to very cautiously mark out a path to get through what I need from this text. The first half of 2:5 raises important questions about the nature of perceptual cognition, mostly concerning how the perceptible object can be said to act on the perceptive subject. Aristotle faces a dilemma. On the one hand, for acts of perception to be possible, there must be some likeness between perceptive power and perceptible object. But on the other hand, if the perceptive power is already sufficiently like its object, then it would be able to activate or ignite itself in the absence of an object. The distinction between activity and potentiality forms a key part of Aristotle's solution. Although the perceptive power is antecedently unlike its object, it is nevertheless potentially like the object and comes to be actually like it when brought to activity. The original distinction between potentiality and activity, then, is introduced to explain how a perceptible object and a perceptive subject could be sufficiently alike so that the object could make the subject to be like itself, without being so alike that the perceptible object becomes superfluous to explain and cause this activity. Aristotle then suggests that this distinction between potentiality and activity requires further development or explanation, and that's when he gives the grammatical example that we just went through. If you note toward the end of that passage on your handout, he locates the inactive possession of both perception and grammatical knowledge at the second stage. Later in 2.5, and this is also printed on the handout, after making another set of distinctions bearing on account of his perceptual cognition, I'm wading through minefields here, Aristotle more clearly explores the analogy between perception and intellection. He says, on the one hand, the first transition of the perceptive power comes to be by the agency of the parent. Whenever one has been born or begotten, he already has the ability to perceive, just as one who has scientific knowledge. On the other hand, to perceive inactivity, kat energeon, is said like contemplating. So the idea here seems to be that nature is sufficient to accomplish the change or transition that equips animals with a ready ability to perceive. Perceptive capacities are unlike the capacity to learn. Their natural development terminates in a stage analogous to stable knowledge, which we normally have to work for. The activity of perception is in turn like deploying knowledge we've already achieved. This goes some way to clarify and constrain his earlier appeal to potentiality and activity in explaining perception, establishing a kind of analogy. Although one difference is already implied in this passage, namely that perception is accomplished through nature and not by learning, he continues by making explicit some further differences between the two cases, and this is also on your handout, so I'll keep reading. But perceiving inactivity differs because the things productive of that activity are external, the visible and the audible, so these perceptible objects. The reason is that perception in activity, kat energeon aesthesis, is of particulars, while scientific knowledge is of universals, and those are somehow in the soul itself. So thinking is up to oneself whenever one wishes, but perceiving is not up to oneself. The perceptible object must be present. So here Aristotle recalls the puzzle with which the chapter began, showing how his account explains why perceptive capacities are not able to ignite or activate themselves, instead requiring some external objects to stimulate them to activity. So despite the schematic analogy he has drawn between perception and intellection, he concedes that at least in some way intellect, in possession of knowledge, can and does activate itself. Okay, the third preliminary is cognitive identity. So many of the clearest articulations of this principle of identity presuppose this analogy between perception and intellection, either implicitly or explicitly. Consider, for example, how Aristotle begins his account of intellect and intellectual thinking in De Anima 3:4. If then thinking is like perceiving, it would be either a kind of being acted upon by the intelligible object or something else of a similar sort. It must therefore be impassive but receptive of the form and potentially like it without being the thing itself. And the cases are similar. Just as the perceptive capacity relates to the perceptible objects, so too the intellect relates to the intelligible objects. Although previously the intellectual case was more evident when he was developing his account of perception, at least in one important respect, he now draws on perception to understand intellect. He draws on his account of formal reception, which has been summarized in a famous passage from the end of Book 2. In general, concerning every kind of perception, it is necessary to understand that perception is receptive of the perceptible forms without the matter, like the wax receives the seal of the ring without the iron or gold. So this model of formal reception, first deployed as a summary principle in his perceptual account, is here presupposed at the beginning of his account of intellect, again by analogy. This model turns out to be the most important likeness between these two forms of cognition, something that remains even while he explains the several ways in which intellect and intellection differ from perception as the account unfolds. This similarity is clearest when Aristotle ends his account of intellect with another reiteration of the analogy, again in terms of formal likeness, but now with a much stronger statement of the identity of knower and known. Here he also recalls the distinctions in actuality and potentiality, which initially structured his account of perception. So this passage from 3:8, which is printed on your handout, is a kind of symphonic final movement where all three of these preliminaries come together. So I'll read it out. Now then, summarizing the things that have been said concerning the soul, let us say again that the soul is in a way all existing things. For existing things are either perceptible or intelligible, and knowledge is in a way the knowables, and perception is in a way the perceptibles. In what way this is so must be investigated. Knowledge and sensation are divided in relation to the things. On the one hand, they are potentially in relation to the things in potentiality, and on the other hand, they are actually in relation to the things in actuality. The perceptive and knowing parts of the soul are potentially the same as knowable and perceptible objects, respectively. Aristotle then goes on to explain this identity of knower and known, and that it's formal, so that the soul does not become a stone, but receives the form of the stone, be it the knowable or the perceptible form, presumably. He thus clarifies the way in which the soul is, in a way, all existing things, in familiar terms. The soul does not become the things themselves, but their cognizable forms, and this is consistent with earlier passages like the seal and the wax. But for our purposes, note how each key preliminary comes together. We see the principle of cognitive identity articulated within the terms of an analogy between perception and intellect, along with an explicit mention of potentiality and actuality on both sides of this analogy, and the Greek is incredibly compressed here, actually. This passage is a capstone to Aristotle's account of intellect, with each one of these three preliminary themes coming together. Okay, so now we're going to ask some questions about how all this works. We might still wonder how precisely this cognitive identity should be understood in perception and intellection, precisely in view of these distinctions between actuality and potentiality. After all, Aristotle explicitly says that knowledge in actuality is ambiguous between knowledge inactively possessed and knowledge that is actively deployed, between having and doing, in other words. Since he opts for the language of actuality, entelecheia, in this capstone passage from 3:8, we ask ourselves, well, what sort of entelecheia, what sort of achievement does he have in mind here? Inactive possession or active exercise? Given some of his earlier remarks and examples, the model of formal reception might be understood as a static relation. So I'm thinking about the signet ring and the wax. You might think of formal reception as something that is achieved principally by coming to possess some form as a kind of cognitive catching. In other words, the passages considered so far are at least consistent with a static interpretation of this cognitive identity, as a having rather than a doing, or if you prefer, an activity. I think that's a mistake, and for reasons that we're already in a position to appreciate. So let's look at perception. Recall that perception in potential already exists at the stage analogous to the possession of stable knowledge. So, in potential, in this capstone passage in 3:8, at least as it applies to perception, must mean the inactive possession of a developed capacity, that middle stage in the schema of act and potency. It follows that in actuality, in this capstone passage 3:8, again, at least in the case of perception, must mean the second sort of actuality, that is, perception and perceptible objects in activity. Therefore, at least for cases of perception, actual cognitive identity is accomplished at the level of activity. This conclusion is further confirmed by claims that Aristotle makes toward the very end of his account of perception, for example, in 3:2. And that's on your handout. the activity of the perceptible object and of perception is one and the same, but their being is not the same. I mean, for example, that sounding in activity and hearing in activity are one and the same. And the phrase in Greek for inactivity here is kat energeon. There's a reason that's the one Greek word that I keep saying. Kat energeon. So this passage clearly indicates that the fullest activity of a perceptible object, insofar as it's perceptible, is in its being perceived. That is, when it is acting on and informing the perceptive capacity of some animal during those active episodes of perceiving. So when this happens, there is not only a formal identity, but also an identity of the activities of cognizer and cognized. Maybe it's better to say that the formal identity of perceiver and object perceived just is the identity of perceptive and perceptible activities, so that the reception of a perceptible form is best understood as a perceptible object actively shaping an animal's perceptual activity according to the form that it has. The ready receptivity of perceptive capacities is only a formal likeness in potential. The form is actually received only in the perceptual activities. The catching metaphor for formal identity, then, is rather misleading, if not wholly wrong-headed, at least in the case of perception. Perceptual identity is not a static possession, but an active resonance, as if the cognizer and cognized are vibrating at the same frequency. I don't know, reach for whatever metaphor you find helpful. Okay, so it's natural to think that the same holds in the intellectual case, but this is where things get tricky. Miles Berniet, and I print this on the handout, he is very helpful in, I think, framing the question, though I think his answer is entirely wrong. He says, cognitive identity occurs, for example, when you wake up in the morning and open your eyes to see the white color of your pillow. When you go to sleep, you do not lose the power of sight, which throughout the night remains at second potentiality / first actuality. For the intellect, many scholars give the parallel answer. The identity is achieved at the transition between first and second actuality, namely in activities. So this is what I want to call the simple view. And it holds that the identity in the intellectual case is achieved at the level of activity, just like in perception. And this is roughly the interpretation I want to adopt and defend. Berniet, by contrast, has described this interpretation in order to reject it. He even claims to have found, quote, the proof text which shows unambiguously that this is wrong, end quote. Instead, Berniet thinks that cognitive identity for the intellect is achieved at some earlier stage, when we possess knowledge but don't necessarily engage in intellectual activity. Here is the translation of the relevant passage from Aristotle's account of intellect, his proof text, and this is printed at the bottom of page 2 of your handout. When the intellect becomes each thing in the way in which an actual knower does, which happens as soon as the knower can exercise their power of their own accord, even then it is still in one sense just a capacity, not, however, a capacity in the same sense as before it learned or discovered. So the second part of this passage very clearly describes the first actuality stage. That is to say, that middle stage of the schema of inactive possession. Are we going, you said 40 minutes for the talk and then 30, because we have 70 minutes total? Okay, sorry. I thought you were getting my attention. Okay, the passage then is rightly read together with earlier passage that we found these distinctions in act and potency. Berniet reads this passage as straightforwardly explicating intellectual identity in terms of that inactive first actuality knowledge. For him, intellectual identity is achieved at an earlier stage than perceptual identity. So I call this his sophisticated view. The perceptual and intellectual cases do not align on this count. Intellectual identity of knower and known is principally a having and not yet a doing or an activity. Berniet does not deny that this intellectual identity is preserved when a knower goes to activity. He affirms, quote, on the contrary, the form already acquired is then actively guiding the knower's thought. Even so, for him, formal reception in the intellectual case does not imply activity. He takes this to be a place where the analogy between perception and intellection breaks down. He feels forced on the basis of this passage from 3:4, which presents a serious challenge to the naive and simple view that cognitive identity is first achieved and most properly located at the level of activity for both cases. So from here on out, that passage, Berniet's so-called proof text, will be my focus, because I want to defend the simple view, but perhaps not naively. I want to give a reading of this passage that's consistent with a view that maintains this analogy between perception and intellect. Okay, in order for this passage to prove what Berniet wants it to prove, he interprets the first part of the passage as also identifying the stage of first actuality, and that's the stage at which this intellectual identity is achieved. He assumes that, as he translated, actual knower describes this first actuality knower, linking this with the second part of the passage that's italicized in his translation. Since actual knower is quite evidently an explication of the very first words of the passage that articulate this cognitive identity, and given this assumption that actual knower means inactive possessor of knowledge, Berniet concludes that this passage proves that intellectual identity is achieved at the level of inactive possession. So Ronald Polanski, in his commentary, makes this assumption explicit when commenting on the same passage. He says, when Aristotle refers to the condition of possessing knowledge rather than actually thinking, the phrase, according to actuality, kat energeon, is ambiguous between dispositional actuality and putting this to use. Now, I, for my part, do not think that the phrase kat energeon is ambiguous in this way. So I am rejecting the assumption that's motivating this proof text for Berniet. In fact, I haven't been translating energeia and related forms as actuality at all, but as activity. I've tried to keep energeia and entelecheia distinct so far, since only the latter, which I've been translating as actuality, is uncontroversially ambiguous in the way Polanski says. The first sort of entelecheia, or actuality, was having but not exercising knowledge. Having, ekein, and not exercising, energein, with a similar use of energein to describe this relation in the later passage of 2:5. The clear and unambiguous meaning of energeia is deployed elsewhere in order to explain the ambiguity of entelecheia. So I want to highlight just how important it is to understand this phrase, kat energeon, correctly. Aristotle uses it in one of the clearest articulations of intellectual identity that I've not quoted yet. And it's found twice in our received text of the De Anima, though some people want to strike it from one of the places, 3:5 and 3:7. He says, actual knowledge, kat energeon episteme, is the same as the thing, pragma. Although this passage is certainly relevant to our present question, whether to conceive of the identity of knower and known as an activity or not, this passage itself can't resolve anything for us. Indeed, Polanski explicitly claims that both of these passages refer to knowledge according to actuality, dispositional knowledge. So taken on their own, such passages simply reflect whatever assumption you bring to the text. If kat energeon admits of this dispositional and inactive interpretation, then one will interpret those claims in that way. So we must look elsewhere to discover what kat energeon can or cannot mean, at least in the De Anima and kindred works. So I don't find any instance of this phrase in the De Anima denoting an inactive dispositional state. I don't find one. So in support of his view, Polanski, again, he's articulating the assumption a little bit more clearly. He cites a passage from 3:2, one that we've already seen before. The activity of the perceptible object and of perception is one and the same, but their being is not the same. I mean, for example, sounding in activity and hearing in activity, kat energeon. For it is possible for something to have hearing but not be hearing, and that which has sound is not always sounding. So Polanski argues that Aristotle has to add that he doesn't really mean the case where an animal has the sense of hearing but it's inactive. Polanski therefore takes Aristotle's clarification to be evidence of some implicit ambiguity in this term kat energeon. I don't think that can be Aristotle's intent, given his practice of explicitly distinguishing terms when they're ambiguous in these ways. Instead, in the passage cited here, Aristotle could merely be explicating what he means without indicating some unmentioned alternative meaning of the term. And when the passage is read as a whole, I think that bears out the fact that kat energeon and similar instances of energeia must mean activity in that passage. And even Polanski grants that. So I think that this passage presents an obstacle to this assumption underlying the sophisticated view. These terms, this family of energeia terms, I think clearly denote activity. Okay, so I don't think the kat energeon epistemon could mean actual knower. It has to mean knower in activity. So if we follow these cues from elsewhere in Aristotle, then also in our passage from 3:4, the so-called proof text, kat energeon should indicate an active knower. According to an active interpretation of kat energeon, this would be a proof text indeed, but one for the exact opposite conclusion that Berniet alleges. But this only makes the passage as a whole all the more puzzling. After all, it is clear and uncontroversial that Aristotle eventually turns to the dispositional knower, describing one who is not exercising his knowledge, who is, quote, even at that time somehow in potentiality, though unlike before he learned or discovered, because he can now exercise his knowledge at will. Given how the rest of the passage is commonly translated, it may seem to be a clear instance where kat energeon not only can, but must refer to the inactive possession of knowledge. Berniet's translation cannot be remedied, in other words, by simply correcting for his translation of this phrase, kat energeon. The burden is on me to give a further account. So in view of the lack of evidence elsewhere, I think it would be very odd if this were the sole passage where the term was used this way. To make matters even more difficult, in the very next line of this proof text, we get an instance of the verb energein that clearly refers to activity when he says the knower who is capable of exercising. On Berniet's and Polanski's and others' understanding of how this passage works, Aristotle would be deploying two energeia-related terms in immediate succession to mean rather different things, and without drawing any explicit attention to that ambiguity. That's not how Aristotle really does things, in my experience. So if kat energeon and related terms only ever indicate activity, how then would these two parts of the passages relate? When and how does Aristotle pivot from this knower in activity to the inactive possessor of knowledge, one who can energein his knowledge but need not now be doing so? However much one might doubt this status as a proof text, Berniet's passage here is really important for understanding Aristotle's account of intellect, and I think it presents an interpretive difficulty for the simple view that's well worth our straining to explore. So I'm only going to be able to sketch what I think is going on here. The first key principle, I think, helping us to understand this passage is that Aristotle thinks that we always learn by doing the things we're learning to do, and maybe we can talk in the Q&A a little bit more about why I think that that applies even in the case of intellectual and theoretical achievements. I have to defer a full defense of that claim, but a representative passage will suffice. I printed it on the handout. And a summary passage from the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, developed states come to be from like activities. And I think this applies even in the case of intellectual learning. So what would this mean for our schema? Already at first potentiality, the unlearned person must already be capable of engaging in certain activities, the doing of which would gradually produce the developed state, in this case, intellectual knowledge. This means that the threefold schema cannot be understood as a linear or temporally ordered process of development. We do not achieve first actuality states without first engaging in some prior activity, that is at least somehow engaging in such activity, that is somehow like the activities that the learned person can engage in stably and at will. Even in the first stage, then, the person must be capable of engaging in some activity, Otherwise, our conception of this schema would contradict his commitment to learning by doing. So I need that to help understand the relation between the knower in activity and the dispositional knower in this passage. So if dispositional states generally come to be from like activities, and if this applies even to intellectual states like knowledge, then intellectual activities would temporally precede and causally affect the development of knowledge. States are not only dispositions for engaging in certain activities, but they are also produced by engaging somehow in those activities. Scientific knowledge, episteme, is defined as a demonstrative state, a hexis apodeictike, which means that it is both produced by and gives rise to demonstrative activities or explanatory activities. So R.E.A. Cosman has a really nice articulation of this. Episteme is the art of discursive disclosure. It is at once brought about by and is the capacity to engage in apodeixis, or explanation. We might say that we come to understand something by having it explained to us, and to understand is in turn to be able to explain it. Now, I don't say that second actuality knowing precedes the development of the hexis. Okay, that second actuality knowing is not the same as activity in general. Although some activity is prior to first actuality knowledge, that activity is not yet stable or deliberate. We have already seen that not every actuality, entelecheia, is an activity, energeia. So too, not every activity, energeia, is an actuality, entelecheia. Not every activity, in other words, is a second actuality. Only by an activity which proceeds from a stable and developed state will count as perfect, complete, and possessing its end in itself. En telos ekein, to understand the Greek of that word for actuality. Even so, it is only by engaging in prior activities that one could ever come to engage in perfect ones. Okay, so this is the philosophical reason I think that something more interesting is going on in this passage. But does the passage actually admit of this reading? Does the text allow me to impose this interpretation on it? So there's some textual and editorial details that need to be resolved. And since this isn't a philology conference, I'm just going to gesture at what I think. And I printed some of this stuff on page 3 and 4 of page 4 of the handout. So as we have seen in that first bit of our key passage, Aristotle uses a correlative construction in the way that the active knower is said to become its object. So it's a houtos hos correlative construction in the Greek. So the link between coming to be its objects and being a knower in activity is very clearly established by the grammar. This identity, coming to be each thing, would be a description of episodes of knowing intellectually in activity, on my view, and would not be something that perdures in the strict sense when those active episodes cease. This contrasts with the sophisticated view, which says that this coming to be each thing is a perduring dispositional state. My interpretation of an intermittent identity is actually an available reading of the Greek, and may actually be grammatically preferable if you look at the Smythe that I put on your handout. The aorist subjunctive need not imply perduring result, permanent result. And the form of the verb we have is an aorist. Though the aorist regularly replaces the perfect, so this isn't strong evidence. This just gets me, keeps my view alive. It doesn't decisively decide it. The sophisticated view also turns on how the two whenever clauses refer to the same situation, both answered by the even at the same time at the end of the passage. But it is not required to read the passage in such a way. Almost all modern editors put the second whenever clause in parentheses. Bernier even italicizes the whole thing. And that would be the second whenever straightforwardly explicating the first. I think that causes a lot of confusion, in large part by implying that two energeia terms would be used very differently in rapid succession, without any kind of indication that he's doing that. Instead, I think we can remove the parentheses and make the "this happens whenever" clause to introduce a distinct thought. And I think that's supported by the "de" in the Greek, the particle there. So only that second clause is answered by the "even at that time" in the final line. So he's talking about the active knower first, and then he pivots and says this happens when there's dispositional knowledge. So I have to hasten to my conclusion here, and I hope we get a chance to discuss some of the details. If I'm right, then this text requires some editorial revision and philosophical reinterpretation in order to avoid some of these difficulties that the sophisticated view faces. There are several advantages to restoring the simple but no longer naive view of intellectual identity, not least of which is the analogy between perceptual and intellectual cases summarized in 3.8. Respectively relating powers in potential to objects in potential, powers in actuality to objects in actuality. And this does not require that in actuality means something different for the two sides of the cognitive analogy, again, without any clear indication of Aristotle. Although the intellectual case differs in that these epistemic forms must be developed by prior activity, and they remain after that activity, by which we can then engage in activity whenever we wish, that ready dispositional state also comes by activity and is itself only potentially the same as its objects when inactive. Intellectual identity, both actual and potential then, is therefore schematically analogous to perception. In both cases, the actual and most proper cognizer is actively cognizing some object whose knowable form principally shapes that cognitive activity.